see it. Okay, fantastic. Okay. It's truly a pleasure. And can everyone hear me okay? Wonderful.
Yep.
Um, to be with you, of course, my fellow historians and my fellow historically minded folk. I love reading about where you are in your journey, and so thank you for putting that in the chat. I'm coming to you from my office here at the Smithsonian, a bit kind of mid-century modern, which I'll explain a little bit about the museum in a minute. But I want to acknowledge with humility and incompleteness that we're here, of course, in what we know as Washington in the District of Columbia. But I speak to you from the unceded lands of the Piscataway people who were joined by the Nacotchtank and Palmunkey tribes as part of the broader Algonquin um, uh, alliance that really still shapes this region today. And so wherever we call home, let us join in acknowledging the layered complexities of our place, give our respect and gratitude to Native local peoples and the opportunity to live and to work and to study in their territories. And let us also just pause. I know you guys just had graduation yesterday. David and I were talking a little bit before you all joined, just about the ongoing challenges and crises that we continue to live in, to to deal with this. And I'm going to go back in time a bit in the last 4 years. And in doing so, of course, I think we all remember the milieu in which we have been existing. Um, but also let us be reminded of our shared humanity, of that which binds us together, and pledge to face all that we are dealing with resiliency and hope. So, oopsie daisy. So yes, I am the seventh Bruin to graduate from UCLA. My sister was the eighth. I was there as an undergrad from 1982 to 86. It did not look like this. This was from 1929, where my grandmother was the first class on the Westwood campus. And UCLA afforded me such a remarkable history education. I was able to weave in art and architectural history, along with sociology, anthropology, geography, and all of this instilled and deepened my very nascent understanding of the complexities and the layeredness of our past, physically, psychically. That's continued to root me as I grow in the greenhouse of life. History as a practice, as David has shared so beautifully, some grounding and essential questions, is for me a prime tool of social justice. It's also in the way in which I've grown personally. It continues to grow resolute in my mind, and it is the key that unlocks the mysteries of humanity, of meaning, of place, of conquest, of love, of power, authority, and self. And as David intimated, as historians, we are tellers of stories and seekers of truths, hopefully embracers of nuance, ambassadors of empathy, and defenders of unalienable rights. And like Julia Kwan, whose mask is shown here, we patch together the past to help us make sense of the present and guide us to all the tomorrows. So I want to take this time to share in a number of ways in which your National Museum of American History is taking an equity-based, justice-forward, community-driven, and necessarily humble approach to public history and to service. I'm very grateful for my colleagues here. I have about 250 colleagues, and I've had such an incredible honor to work with them these last 5 years, but really in the field now for almost 35 years. So we're at the Smithsonian's flagship and most visited history museum, the most visited U.S. history museum in the world. We welcomed over 3 million people here in the building in situ last year and over 12 million people online. And as David said, we take stewarding the nation's memory and collections, and we hold them in trust for the people of the United States. And the richness, I think, of our pasts, plural, of course, is testament to the struggles of those who worked and who fought, continue to work and fight to create a better future and press the nation to live up to its stated ideals. But of course, we have our inheritances here, our immovable past, if you will, like this 1961 photo of when the building was still under construction. Yes, the largest steam locomotive ever made, of course, was trained inside, showing great American prowess. The museum was born and opened in 1964 as the Museum of History and Technology, and you can really kind of feel this kind of Cold War, we're going to be the best and most technologically advanced country in the nation, and we're going to show everyone how we did that. But of course, we've moved quite a way. Not so much away from that in terms of some people's minds, but we clearly have moved away from that. But the museum is about almost 800,000 square feet. Our site here is about 14 acres. I hope that some of you have come to see us, and if not, visited us online. We steward conservatively about 2 million objects, 3.5 linear shelf miles of archival material, and growing terabytes of digital collections as well. I arrived in 2019, as I intimated, and by 2020 we had worked together to adopt a new 10-year strategic plan. It guides our work and ensures our active participation with communities. We have a new mission, of course, as you can see, that we strive to empower people to create that more just and compassionate future as we together explore, preserve, and share the complexities of our past. And we've challenged ourselves. I challenged my staff when I first came. What does it look like to become the most accessible, inclusive, relevant, and sustainable public history institution in the nation? And so how will we know we're succeeding? We gave ourselves a marker, which in 2019, 2020 was like, oh, it felt like so long away in the future, but by 2030, that we would be serving an audience that reflects the full demographies of the nation. And so since then, our initiatives have included a proactive multilingual strategy to support language justice. The idea, of course, that everyone has the right to communicate in the language in which they feel most comfortable, to be understood and to understand. And thus, since fall of 2019, all exhibitions and signage and digital projects will be at least bilingual in English and Spanish, and a number of them in more languages, really depending on the project and the communities of origin. And uplifting this bold new vision, we strive to embody the utmost, of course, in professional standards and meaningful work in public history and in public service. Here are just some fun slides of some school groups visiting. I want to reflect, as I hinted, on these last 4 years, for those who graduated yesterday or for those who are still in their undergraduate years. Of course, this is so much a representation of your scholarly life, but really for all of us, wherever we are, think about these 4 years together. And we asked ourselves, and I want to share a bit with you today, how do we mark this time? What do we do as the nation's flagship history museum? And when I closed this museum on Friday the 13th of March, never really used to believe much in Friday the 13th, but in 2020, our scholars here had already been tracking the SARS-2 virus spread. We had already been, of course, documenting the 2020 presidential elections. I actually pulled curators from the Iowa caucuses that week and sent them home to quarantine. So really kind of from our kitchen tables, from a closed museum, we set to work to collect the multiple interlocking pandemics and crises of 2020 and to contextualize them in deep and meaningful contours of the past through our scholarship. as you know, you can imagine, for some of you who I'm not sure if any of you were in Washington, but let me know if you were during this time. It was an amazing moment to be here. We did things like create the stories of 2020. We gathered, like many repositories did across the country, in many history museums, historical societies. We gathered stories. What was it like to live in 2020? We had text and photographs and video clips. We did this remarkable 24 hours in a time of change where we just went across the country with 10 different partners and simultaneously engaged constituents on a single day on December 11th, 2020, just to show us what your day was like. Because we could, of course, we had a conversation that the digital age afforded us, and obviously we're still doing this together on Zoom. But we asked people across place and across communities to help us make sense of what their lives were like. How did the pandemic, the recession, the marches for justice, the pain and agony of losing loved ones, how was that? How did it feel? What was life like for them? For us, we focused on that kind of first person testimonial for our 24 hours. And what does it look like when you know you're kind of in a historic turning point, when you're living through it? So it was a remarkable way in which, again, we could be historians in this time. We had a front row seat, of course, as I mentioned, to the heart of the drama, to protest, to the lockdown, to the community outpouring, to marching in the streets, to the national and international reaction to the murders, especially of George Floyd that summer, and thought really deeply about our place as historians, the way in which we had already reached teachers and students and their families via our online educational resources, of course, skyrocketed. So many people, which we're honored to provide, look to us for helping them both make sense of the world, but actually to teach. We were there in Lafayette Square, looking for those moments where we all came together. This is an amazing group of survivors and whose ancestors, and some of whom themselves as young people, were interred during World War II in the incarceration camps set up to what ended up being to house about 120,000 Japanese Americans during World War II. They, of course, are creating solidarity with not just Black Lives Matter, but doing work on the border. Truly a remarkable group. And this kind of remarkable ephemeral museum site of protest that was created in those weeks in June of 2020 in Lafayette Square, where, of course, as barricades went up around the square that's just north of the White House, the activism went up along with it. And these phenomenal ephemeral statements, signs, it's an entire outfit expressing that kind of very heartfelt and incredibly poignant when we were down here collecting and talking to people about a kind of an international approach as well to that kind of support. The museum joined a very collaborative Smithsonian-wide collecting effort around Black Lives Matter. Of course, like as I said, it started here in Lafayette Square, but it evolved into a much broader commitment to document and preserve and share objects focused on Black Lives Matter and really doing the history of the movement from 2012 onward, focusing on Black life, Black activism, Black cultural producers, Black protest. So we're working with people in Los Angeles, unsurprisingly, given the origins there, Minneapolis, New York, Ferguson, Tallahatchie County, Mississippi, and we continue to do that work today. Some of these, of course, are very famous moments from that summer, that hot summer in June, and I'm hoping some of them that you haven't seen before. This was literally crocheted onto the fence. And then it's always good to see your boss, Secretary Lonnie G. Bunch III, the founding director of the National Museum of African American History and Culture, who's now the secretary of the Smithsonian. This was our Smithsonian statement in the 1619 project, but that someone had cut and put into this insertion of so many different signs and paintings into this, what ended up being about a 2.5, 3 block community art project. With the museum closed, obviously we turned so much of our emphasis online, supporting each other, supporting the nation. But I also realized that our building, of course, the north side that you're seeing here is on Constitution Avenue, pretty historic itself, and that we could use our building and all of our exterior signs, which we had go around the entirety of the building, to telegraph what we were thinking about inside. And this is a beautiful Fannie Lou Hamer quote that nobody's free until everyone's free, in English and Spanish. That was up all summer. We cultivated relationships with activists, local organizers. We sat on many a Zoom call and sometimes in person, masked. But remember, of course, this is before vaccines. This is in a time of just this intense uncertainty and frailty, as life as we knew it was falling down around our feet. We also launched 2 new centers in the pandemic that we had been working on, but thought it was important to continue this important work. We launched the Center for Understanding Religion in American History and the Center for Restorative History. And amazingly, we also installed all kinds of exhibits that summer and that fall, because 2020 was supposed to be the year of the woman, when we were celebrating the centennial of women's suffrage. We're going to get our year yet, ladies, I'm here to tell you. The first key project of the new Center for Restorative History, and I'm happy to talk more about that center afterwards, or really anything I mentioned, I'm happy to talk about. When we reopened the museum, we opened a little bit in the fall of 20, but then closed it down again, and then reopened in the spring of 21. And in the fall of that year, we displayed the first object that the new center had collected, which is a historic marker from Sumner, from Tallahatchie County, Mississippi, the site where young Emmett Till's body was pulled up from the Tallahatchie River in 1955. And of course, the lynching of Mr. Till, the lack of prosecution for his unrepentant murders, led, as many of you know, to an incredible galvanization of the civil rights movement. A biracial commission in Mississippi had created this series of interpretive signs to show that young Emmett's journey that fateful summer of 1955. And this sign was repeatedly shot up. This is the second sign on that site. There's now the 4th sign, which is bulletproof. But we sat with the community from 2019, when I first started here, until 21, when they gifted this sign to us. It has 317 different bullet marks in this sign. We displayed it first for a month right in the center of the museum, and now it is in its own differently curated, quiet space on our 2nd floor. But these panels, you see each word. It was born in English and translated to Spanish. Each word was very carefully curated with the community in Tallahatchie, Mississippi. We welcomed, and painfully, as painful as it was, the public reflection on the enduring legacies of anti-Black violence, underscoring, of course, the importance of historic memory. At the same time, we worked with artist Suzanne Brennan, who did 2 installations of tiny little landscaping flags in which people wrote, or we wrote for them. If they couldn't come to Washington, they would send in their memories and their notes, giving people an opportunity to mark the lives of those that had died from COVID. And so this is showing a September 21 installation around the Washington Monument, pretty recognizable there, when there were just less than 700,000 people who had died from COVID. And of course, that number is now reaching towards 1.2 million in 2024. But we were also able to work with some of the families and collect some of the flags. So this slide shows you the big installation, a close-up, and then what we were able to do inside the museum, which was this really incredible moment to capture that kind of simultaneity where you could see it on the National Mall and then actually read some of them inside. So that was a remarkable collaboration and collecting. We also, there's another close-up of that. We also worked with communities across the country. If you imagine how we collect at the museum, and any museum collects, is a conversation about an object, about story, about what we call, provenance, understanding the object's path and where it has come from and its authenticity. But we couldn't do that regular collecting pattern, so we did a lot of this work. We have vast COVID collections, and people had to hold them for us until we were able to collect them, including this banner. The Chinese community and elders in San Francisco organized a march through Chinatown on the 29th of February. Remember, 2020 was a leap year, marching through the streets of San Francisco. So this is before the World Health Organization had declared COVID a pandemic, but they were already starting to see a decrease in visitation, which of course was so traumatic to small businesses there. They were starting to see the rise of anti-Asian hate crimes. They were really starting to see life kind of turned upside down. And again, this is the end of February 2020. So they kept that banner for us. And then we installed it in the museum. In fact, it's still up. It's still up now. We installed it in 2022. 2022 was an amazing year for us. We also were honored that the newly minted National Museum of the American Latino opened its first gallery here, the Molina Family Gallery, which had been under construction and under consideration before legislation was passed to create one of our newest museums. So it was just a remarkable couple years, and especially that year for us. We also worked to, on the 1-year anniversary of the pandemic's official start, we worked to collect the first known doses of the FDA-approved COVID-19 vaccine administered in the United States. On December 14th by Northwell Health up in Brooklyn, New York. And this is Dr. Sandra Lindsay. She was an intensive care nurse. She's now finished her work, and she is Dr. Sandra Lindsay. But she is the first person known to receive the vaccine in the United States. So she gave us her badge and her scrubs and her shoes. She wore her clogs so much that they broke. They literally kind of fell off her feet one day. So she gave us those as well. And then Pfizer and Northwell Health gave us the empty vials, even the cases through which the early vaccines were kept chilled. Of course, humanitarian crises abounded. They still have always abounded throughout time, but these past 4 years in particular, 4 to 5 years. And we also then have been collecting and working closely with Sister Norma Pimentel and her work along the U.S.-Mexico border. Um, working we collected these in 2021 from Catholic Charities of the Rio Grande Valley, along with an oral history of Sister Norma, who, of course, many of you might recognize her. She established the Humanitarian Respite Center in McAllen, Texas, to provide short-term shelter and care to migrants after they were released by the Border Patrol. And in those years, even in the pandemic, they, of course, served tens and hundreds of thousands of refugees. And so in the Sister Norma collection, we have amazing artwork like this. This is a copy of the print she gave to Pope Francis, called Tomasito. And shoes, we have a number of shoes that she donated to the museum, worn by a migrant on their journey to the United States, actually from Guatemala. This pair is one of the first things that the migrants often want, of course, when they enter their respite center, are shoes. And they're given shoes, and then they have the option of keeping them or leaving their shoes. And Sister Norma uses the leftover shoes, the discarded shoes, to talk about her work, and it's an honor to share a bit of that with you today. And of course, 2021 also brought with it an unexpected collecting opportunity down the mall from us at the nation's capital. And I wrote in a statement that I issued, I think on January 9th, and just to quote that statement, that the January 6th attack on the Capitol and on the foundation of the United States Democratic Republic revealed the fragility of our political system. As the nation's flagship history museum, our staff is committed to documenting and, most importantly, preserving this history for future generations to understand how the events of that fraught day unfolded and to track their ongoing impacts. End quote. So early in the morning on the 7th of January, we moved into our kind of what we call a rapid response protocol to collect very ephemeral material. You saw a lot of ephemeral material that we documented, and some of which we collect up at Lafayette Square the year before, but we collected rally signs, posters, flags, whips, wooden poles, all discarded on the National Mall. And then we put out basically anyone could offer us anything from that day, and we have some very complicated material that we're still processing, and some of which is still actually with the FBI. Once the kind of the energy and the madness and the complications of the immediate aftermath, and especially after the inauguration of President Biden, we got to really kind of fill in some stories, and people came forth like Madeline Kelly, who, this is her black protective vest. She's a freelance photographer, and she knew she had been accosted, but what she didn't know is that she had been attacked by a knife-wielding rioter. And so it's hard to see, there's a big gash in her protective jacket here. And then what you're also seeing is the back of my amazing colleague Frank Blasich's car with some of the material he collected that next morning. On a slightly lighter note, we collected this takeout bag from one of Chef Jose Andres' DC restaurants. Jose, of course, started the World Central Kitchen and is a dear friend of the museum and a remarkable advocate for history. But I do love this, especially given the mission of the Luskin Center and our topic for today. And thinking about this talk and all of you, my mind certainly goes to many moments over my 33-year public history career, but it returns to the importance of the crossroads of community, memory, justice, and relevance. And when Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture opened in 2017, President Obama followed President George W. Bush in offering comments. And I'm quoting President Obama, who's quoting President Bush. As President Bush just said, a great nation doesn't shy from the truth. It strengthens us. It emboldens us. It should fortify us, President Obama said. It is an act of patriotism to understand where we have been. And just last week, we saw how survivors of the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre bravely continued to seek accountability for a very dark part of the nation's past, only to be denied justice yet again. On the 12th of June last week, Oklahoma Supreme Court dismissed a lawsuit filed by the remaining survivors of the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre, Hughes Van Ellis, Viola Fletcher, Leslie Benningfield Randall. And actually, sadly, Ellis died last year at the age of 102. But the plaintiffs argued that they should be compensated by the city for damages resulting from one of the worst single act of violence against Black people in the U.S., left as many as 300 people dead, and of course a once thriving Black-owned business district smoldering in ruins. We had the centennial, of course, of the Tulsa Race Massacre also happening in 2021 in the midst of everything that I just shared with you about. The city of Tulsa, of course, the plaintiffs argued, was also gaining revenue by promoting the site of a massacre as a tourist attraction without sharing any of the revenue with the community that impacted. And we see this as an example of both how the United States' kind of long and violent racial history continues to be present in our reckoning, if you will. Redress in the form of reparation, of course, goes beyond acknowledgement and wrongdoing. It should leverage responsibility. It should think about the act of correction as we pursue restorative justice, and for us, restorative justice through history. Just to wrap up, because we'll have plenty of time for questions, Congressman and Civil Rights Lion John Lewis declared, I quote, "It's only through examining history that you become aware of where you stand within the continuum of change," end quote. So I challenge you all, regardless of discipline, time, place, age, situations, to dive into that continuum, to be a part of that change that you want to see. Participate in the defense of history as it and we who know it, who teach it, who live it. As you know, we're yet again under attack for speaking complicated truths, so raise your voices and speak them together. It's been wonderful to be with you, and I'm not leaving yet. And it's been a great honor to offer you just a sample of our work here at the museum, but really the work of so many people around the country, and especially some really important work going on in the greater LA area, which is still, of course, very close to my heart. We do not do this work alone. We do it in partnership with people and communities throughout the nation. And I remain grateful to be a part of that continuum. And please know, in your own work, in your own thinking, in your own community understandings and activism, that we are here with you. We're here for you, for your research, for your degrees, for your students, for your studies, and for your community. I'll end with, please stay in touch. That's my email and my mobile number. And also just one of my favorite objects. I get asked that a lot, like, "Oh, Dr. Hartig, what's your favorite object?" That's totally unfair, but this is one of them. This is Minnie Jean Brown, now Minnie Jean Brown Tricky's 1959 high school graduation dress. As you know, she was one of the Little Rock Nine. Um, her time in Little Rock at Central High was incredibly challenging and if not torturous. And when she finally kind of fought back and tried to defend herself, she was expelled. She finished high school in New York with an aunt who took her in and designed and handmade this dress and gifted it to us as part of our girl. And we showed it as part of our Girlhood It's Complicated exhibition that we were able to open in the fall of 2020. And if you haven't kept in track of the Little Rock Nine, whose brave integration story there, Minnie Jean is a good one to track. So I'll leave you with the hope and the beauty that this dress represents, and happy to answer any questions. And to thank you again. Thank you, David. Thank you to the Luskin Center staff. And really thanks to all of you for spending your time on these warm summer days to continue to learn the ways in which history can be so useful as a practice. And of course, for me, as an avocation and a vocation. So.
Thank you so much, Anthea. Really wonderful presentation. Um, and it raises many, many questions. As I noted in my last message, please feel free to pose any questions you have in chat or to raise your hand. I know I have some questions, but I really would love to see if we can begin with someone other than myself as the first questioner. So.
Yeah, I think maybe I saw Kaya or Tatiana. No, I don't see the hands. Or were you?
I think everyone was clapping.
Oh, clapping. Oh, thank you.
All right, I'm going to jump in and encourage everybody to follow suit. Again, either by raising a hand or by adding questions in chat. I want to talk about something that is so central to your mission at the museum, which is navigating the very rough waters relating to the politics of history in a very real sense. I mean, we historians often talk about the politics of history, and sort of that means a number of different things, including sort of the subjective, identitarian perspectives that we bring to the study of history. You operate in an environment inside the Beltway in which your very status depends on whether or not you meet the standards and expectations of a very divided, fractious group of politicians.
Mm-hmm.
And you've articulated a vision of the museum, and for that matter of history, in which the quest for justice and indeed reparative justice is central. And so first, I'd just like to ask, can you tell us what it's like to engage in that work of navigation in order to keep your institution afloat? And then maybe we can make our way to sort of how you navigate more specifically your vision of history, which is not everybody's vision of history, your vision of history in this enormously contentious time and space. So just what's it like? I mean,
Sure. Well, first of all, I mean, how many people have been to the museum? Nice. Okay. So a couple. All right. Please first all come. Cheap flights, sometimes, sometimes not, depending on the season. You're all welcome. I would love, love, love to see you. I'd love to welcome you. I joke if it's not a critter or a rocket ship, it probably ended up in our collection. There's probably something that you would want to study um, because of the huge breadth, everything from numismatics to physics, from the history of entertainment to the history of suffrage. It's a remarkable collection, and it is truly all available for you for research and for literally that feeling of getting to hold history in your hands is it's remarkable. And as you think about practice this week and about research, um, the power of having a digital archive, and we're actively very working on digitizing um, the the kind of the heavy bulk of the collection. Um, but there's also, of course, nothing like that feeling of live archival research. So you're pleased, you're all welcome. On politics, so the the Smithsonian was founded, of course, in eight, don't ask historians questions. You know this because you, how do you make a watch, really? What time is it? So, but when we're founded in the 1840s, 1846, they looked to the academy because it's universities were really the only model they had to create an institute for the increase in diffusion of knowledge of all men. Of course, we've dropped the all men part. So they looked to the academy and they set up a board of regents. This is a gift that came in from a bastard son of an English lord who was an incredible scientist and entrepreneur who left his entire estate to his nephew. And if his nephew died, it would go to the young United States. This was like in the 1830s when we could barely tie our shoelaces. Um, as a nation state, we're busy doing all kinds of other things, but um, it would go to the United States to create this institution. So they look to the academy, and so they create a board of regents, secretary. They start to set up the Smithsonian. So what it means, though, in terms of governance and politics, David, and wonderful 60 plus of you, or 60 of you, is that the chancellor of the Board of Regents of the Smithsonian is always the acting Chief Justice of the United States. The Vice Chancellor of the Board of Regents is always the Vice President of the United States. And then there are congressional regents and public regents. Over time, the public regents have taken on, they've elected a president, and they do more of the daily fiduciary work. But there is no other institution in the nation, never mind in Washington, that has all three branches actively represented. We, of course, now have Chief Justice Roberts and Vice President Harris as a pretty amazingly complicated duo. Chief Justice Roberts is a history major from Harvard, and Vice President Harris, of course, is very, very close um, to her own history, her own history making, and so it's fascinating. So there is that balance. David knows this, though, that sometimes that balance, especially with politicians who are playing gotcha politics, has increased recently, where I'll have congresspersons or senators have sent their young staff in to read every label and to kind of argue. If I have senators and congresspersons here, which I often do, I see that as really incredible opportunities to have conversations. To David, to your beautiful three grounding questions, we rely on our own interpretive lens. We acknowledge our own um, places from which we have studied, places from which we come at history, and how that infuses our work. Um, and then I really do see opportunities, like when a congressperson from Nebraska asked me why Spanish was the other language in our museum, and only part of the museum because they've only been here 5 years, and it was a great opportunity to talk to him about languages spoken, about the percentage of Latinos self-identified in the country, about language justice, which was, he had never heard of the term. He wasn't sure he agreed with it, but nor had he ever really kind of conceptualized in what language. And so if he sees Braille, if he sees hearing devices, if he sees tactile representations of the objects that we have in our exhibitions for blind and low vision guests, I think accessibility, inclusivity made some sense to him in a way that had not made sense to him before. So again, sometimes you just educate. And then, like tomorrow, Secretary Bunch will be on the Hill in front of the Appropriations Committee. You try and really make sure they understand the work that we do. You understand how it makes sense and how it works in their communities. Um, and um, And you have to find the courage of your convictions. I mean, this kind of flat out. That's where we all are in life right now, right? It's locating the courage of our convictions. Again, approaching them with humility and grace, but approaching them with resiliency and fortitude. For me, as I grounded my comments, the power of history has always been um, so um, demonstrable, right? I could feel how it worked. Like you could feel the way in which I could understand and deepen my understanding of our shared humanity and um, how long, of course, some of the good fights have been fought. But it's fascinating. Congress provides the Smithsonian about $1 billion a year, which sounds like a lot, except that it's spread over 21 museums, 11 research institutes, the zoo, our Tropical Research Institute in Panama. I mean, it's actually one of the smallest per capita appropriations of any federal agency. So you also have to try and make sure that you do a lot of internal work. It's, we our work has to be grounded in scholarship, which is why historians, our work as historians, our work as scientists, our work as arts administrators, kind of all of the, for me, all the public history work we do is is um, is so essentially grounded in scholarship and in research. So
Okay, again, I encourage others to raise their hands. I certainly
yeah,
have many follow-ups, but I'd
yeah.
like to invite
Oh, there's
anyone
one from
else.
George.
Um, Questions?
Specific policy changes, like throughout the country or throughout the Smithsonian, George, or I can tell you what I think I know your gist, but feel free to come on camera. Probably throughout the country, probably one of the most powerful ones that I think we can, again, with humility, acknowledge our assistance and place in is that when I mentioned the incredible Emmett Till marker project down in Tallahatchie County, Mississippi, um, the that is now a National Park Service historic monument, and the Park Service has said that without kind of our work in collecting that one sign, and it's just one part of what they've done down there, and still a terribly small community. There's like 5,000 people in Sumner, and the courthouse in which Emmett's murders were tried is still standing in this town square. They've got a Confederate statue right next to the courthouse, still claiming dominance over the narrative. And the Emmett Till Community kind of Interpretive Center that we helped, um, and I'm really learned so much from them, and they feel learned so much from us. That's a direct kind of, that's a really beautiful tie. And so then what that means, it's complicated, right? But it means there'll be federal dollars that'll go towards interpretation. There'll be creation of jobs for the monument staff through the Park Service. There'll be storytelling. I mean, Emmett's story, thanks to his mother, thanks to so many people in Chicago and here in Washington, but especially those down in Mississippi, uh, have told his story so poignantly, but there'll be more. So that's certainly one. The One of the other key policy changes that's just happened this month internally um, has been, I'm the liaison to the Pride Alliance here. And for the first time in the history of the Smithsonian, we flew the Pride flag last year and this year. And so that's a small thing in a way, but also not in a way, to fly the Pride intersexual Pride flag during June. When my time at the California Historical Society, I can give you other examples in my time. Before that, I was the regional director in the West for the National Trust for Historic Preservation, so dealing with immovable heritage. I love dealing with both immovable and movable heritage. Movable heritage is a little more challenging because you're dealing, as the Luskin Center well knows, with place, real estate, um, and thus wealth and authority and greed and all the good things that come along with that. Um, but I love that intersection. I started my PhD at UC Riverside, right out of UCLA. I was going to be a colonial Americanist. Trained with Gary Nash, Joyce Appleby, amazing, amazing historians in British colonialism. And I did my master's, and then I realized that they had this separate program that was a kind of had an interesting, strange relationship in the history department. It was then, instead of called public history, it was called the Program in Historic Resources Management or something really archy. And I thought, wow, I've always loved the way in which history actually takes place and has meaning in our daily lives. And so that program focused on historic preservation, museum curation, archival management, and conservation of building materials and the materials of historic um, objects and documents. And so I switched over and finished my master's in historic resources management, which is now the public history program at UCR. And I remember talking to it was quite the scandal because no one had really gone from a PhD scholarship over from the normal or regular track or whatever it was called then to the public history track. But I remember just thinking very vividly that I wanted to actually impact policy. I wanted to be on the ground with my history. And so I worked for two cities. I held two or three different state commissions from two or three different governors. Um, all of this was, still working full time and finishing my PhD and having two children. By the way, you can do anything. It just sometimes takes you longer. Um, but that intersection of history and policy, which is why I love the work of the Luskin Center, um, unpaid endorsements, um, because it is because it's so grounded in that in pushing together like the intersections of policy. So yeah, I've worked on a lot of different policy um, sectors, some very official ones, some federal level, state level, and then local as well. Instituting public art programs for cities that are grounded in history, doing oral history projects of people who made history, who have stories to tell, but who are not in any history books, local, state, or regional, or national. So, does that help?
Okay, I'm going to go back. I'm going to jump back in and give people time to formulate
Okay.
questions, which they can
Mhm.
send on or raise their hand. Just the current moment, and by the current moment, I don't mean the last week. I mean the last decade.
Mm.
Um, the
Okay.
world of the post-truth world, and what
Yeah.
that means for you. So you operate in a world in which some people believe um, that vaccinations for COVID-19 were a major health breakthrough, and some people believe that they were either of no value whatsoever or destructive.
Or put tiny
Some
little microchips in our bloodstream. Yeah.
Right. Some people believe that January 6th was an insurrection directly instigated by the President of the United States. Other people believe that either January 6th was a false flag operation, something
Right.
begun by Antifa, or just a kind of
Yeah.
demonstration in the park, like any other demonstration in the park. Your job is to collect history, um, and in some sense, put forward what you imagine to be the historical past as it should be understood.
Yeah.
So, how do you operate in this environment? I mean,
Yeah.
where it's not just like the rest of us, say out in California, you're in Washington, D.C., where like budget lines are decided.
Yeah.
Um, and these questions are immensely divisive amongst our elected officials. So,
Sure. Well, and of my donors and supporters. So right now,
and your donors and supporters.
between half on a really, really good year, maybe two-thirds of the budget at the museum comes from Congress, and probably technically the president's budget. Congress ratifies it. Um, and then I raise the rest. So of my $50 million budget this year, when we finally got our appropriation, it was 28.6 million. So yeah, so there's a lot of competing. I mean, one of the great things about what history teaches is to understand how competing tensions, how competing forces all work, right? Because in the end, we're also cultural geographers. We have to map, I have a little post-it, power, influence, and authority, right? Map it, understand it, look at it. Um, and the solace or the salve of history on the wounds perpetrated to the body of truth and justice are many, but history does also provide opportunities in which kind of rampant misinformation has guided um, um, generally kind of the edges of thought, right? Not always, but the the most vehement. Um, our job is, I call it in the grist mill of history, which is a very like 18th, 19th, 18th century metaphor or simile. We are the grist, sometimes it feels, but we get to document the grist and the stones and the mill and really try and see how it makes sense all together. And also to not waver from the principles on which our work stands. We don't necessarily, there are plenty of people who deny the climate crisis. The Smithsonian does not. Our scientists, whether they are down at STRI in Panama or next door at the Natural History Museum or out in our Tidewater Research Center or up at the National Zoo or in my building who studied the history of the environment here, it is an undeniable fact of the Anthropocene. But yet we encounter every day people who do not want to believe that, right? Who do not want to believe that what the science and the data tells us. So part of it is to provide people with enough evidence that ideally they can either make up or change their mind. But the old adage of kind of meeting people where they are and bringing them along has gotten very, very challenged. I won't sugarcoat it. But I'm also a very firm and hopeful believer in in that, especially in this environment. So you walk in, we don't have time passes anymore. We did a little bit in the pandemic. You walk in anytime between 10 and 5:30 every day except the 25th of December. You truly have no idea who you're going to meet here. And so if we bring you all around ask for volunteers, and we bring you around a 30 by 40 foot flag, a replica of the Star Spangled Banner, and ask you to help fold it, which is actually really hard if you can think about folding a 30 by 40 foot flag. And we talked to you about the history of the flag. We talked about the complicated history of Francis Scott Key, but we talked to you kind of what it feels like and means like to come together in community to get something done. And so the strategic plan that I'm happy to share with you, this interpretive plan, the collections plan, I've quoted you the mission and vision from 2020 that we adopted, all focuses on key principles within that big mission statement, and studying how and honoring how people have come together to make change. Not always necessarily positive change, but less about that, and then how we've come into community. Where are those intersections? Because if you see the disparity of belief right now, let's take COVID vaccines. If they're two spheres, there's an and. There are people who believe right in that they were beneficial. They're not a scientist. We're like, this is the essential. What we did with DNA transformed the practice in the history of vaccines. And they're not over here on there are little microchips floating around my body. Um, I want to work more in the and. I want to push those spheres together and
Mm,
figure out where people are coming together. What questions can we help them answer? We have the whole history of vaccines
mhm,
from 1793 smallpox, where of course they gathered it, from infected cattle through Salk, polio, et cetera. So then can we be helpful in understanding, right, that long arc? Can we ground them in a way in which the scientific method employed by humans is something that they partake in too? We're about to open next week a forensic science on trial exhibition, which is really cool.
mm.
It's really small, totally powerful, because we have the first like lie detector test. Of course we do, from 19 whatever 24. Um, but we're showing the DNA sample from the scientists who took it from the OJ trial. Right? So showing like bite mark analysis, right? So all of this was like the the way in which we understand data, what we bring to it. And then hopefully you can kind of bring in people who are like, well, see, it's always been this way. We've always like superimposed our beliefs. And then you can acknowledge that. You can say, absolutely, we use this data for our own purposes. But in this exhibit, think with us about what it means around justice. Think about what a breakthrough it is. We have some of the real early work done on DNA testing. Think what a breakthrough it is when you can actually identify people. Um, and another exhibition will open next year on the history of public health, where we collected the first prototype of sexual assault kit done
Mm,
by
mm.
a woman named Dr. Marty. What's Marty's last name? Marty Blaine. So it's called Marty's Kit. Um, that'll be the first time that it's ever been seen.
Mm. Okay, I have more questions
Oh,
about
sorry. Okay.
during line, but I see Mike has a question, so I'm going to hand things over to Mike.
Okay. Oh, some great questions in the chat. Sorry.
Sure. Thank you for this presentation and thank you for the opportunity to ask a question.
Sure.
Mine may go beyond the scope of the work you do with the museum, so it's more like a question for historians and thinking, when you do comparative research and you're trying to understand different paths and histories of how policies have played out in space and time, what I find is there are communities or there are cases where there's less archival data or there's been less of a historical framing of what happened by people who were able to hold the archival data for us to look at now.
Absolutely.
So these are historical questions of equity and justice kind of show up in what data gets preserved, what's available. What I've been interested in knowing more about was sort of how, maybe it's a two-part question.
Yeah.
In what ways do you see the Smithsonian adding as a corrective to a dearth or absence of archival history that can now be reevaluated and reanalyzed in new contexts? I
Mm-hmm.
see some of that in what you presented today, but I'm just curious. And the other would be around geography and place,
Mm-hmm.
because even in the US, like I did work around tobacco and farming and agriculture in North Carolina historically around labor.
Yeah.
And the way that story is told within the North Carolina archival work is very different than how it would be told in other sources. So
Yeah.
just thinking a little bit about sort of how you can do good comparative work where maybe historians or policy analysts orient to cases where we have rich archival data and then we omit historical pieces of the puzzle because we don't know how to get access to or we don't know where that is. So any of those may be helpful to think about.
Yeah, thanks, Mike, and feel free to follow up as well. Excellent questions. So since, um, well, probably 25, 30 years now, but especially since the publication of Michelle Rolfe Trujillo's slender, beautiful book, Silencing the Past, the silences of the archives, right? The way in which archives are silenced, which he breaks down into three different ways, but especially just by sheer omission or sheer violence, right? I mean, we still see that, right? You destroy libraries, archives, museums of a culture that you want destroyed and the people you want destroyed. We see that sadly all over the world. So the most important thing is being cognizant of the silences. and then to actually to mind, to go into the dark spaces, put your headlamp of history on an inquiry, um, to go into those darker spaces to see what you can find. And often you can find truly luminescent things, but you haven't necessarily looked for them, you haven't asked for them, or they don't exist in any kind of material form. And that's where the incredibly important oral practice and field of oral history comes in. And um, I never try and overlook that, right? That critical importance. I love what you were asking though about comparative research, because I do think that, let's say if you took, like I studied citrus workers in Southern California in the 1880s to the 1920s. If you take that same time period in the tobacco fields in North Carolina, or the cotton fields, you'd find certain kind of I think actually key political similarities, because a lot of the Southern California citrus growers that I studied actively called their ranches plantations. You know, we could just start there, right? Nomenclature. But because in the end they wanted to kind of reproduce a labor structure that allowed them wealth accumulation off the backs of others. So I do think I think there's a lot of room for that, but you're right in terms of the way in which you can read the Southern California landscape is very different than the way in which you can read the North Carolinian landscape, which you can still kind of squint in places and go, oh yeah, that probably hasn't changed much in 100 years, right? Very hard to say that, let's say, about the citrus landscape. You can imagine, like, for those of you who grew up in Southern California or anywhere really, like Santa Paula or Fillmore or around Ojai is one of the only places where you can kind of think, oh yeah, this is what like Olive Orange County looked like, right? So it's not impossible to read our landscape. It's just, I think it's more challenging, especially in the Southland. But if you take those kind of that toolkit together of archival research, archival mining, understanding the silences, understanding where and how the archives might be hidden or non-existent, and then and then layer in that cross-disciplinary work for me is essential, and especially once you then establish it within place. I often found that place then kind of generated a lot of the clues you would need to then continue to explore whatever archival record was left, or create it yourself. I mean, oral histories are basically creating your own archive. And unsurprisingly, then the Center for Restorative History here, one of our first important hires was an oral historian. So, but thank you. But follow up with me if you need. Okay, I'm going to go up to the historic research, Gensen.
Yeah, I'm
Yeah,
seeing two questions in the chat.
yeah. Oh, yeah,
One of which asks
yeah.
about
Great,
the
digital.
what I'm seeing Yunjin's question about sort of the American focus of
Oh, I'm going to go up
Yunjin-
to Gensen, who was
ah
first at 1:18 my time.
okay, go ahead.
Yeah. Do you mind?
Not at all.
Okay.
We have three questions in the chat then, and
Uh-huh. Yeah.
we have about 10 minutes, so let's
Oh,
make it
okay.
sort of.
All right, I'll be fast.
Yeah.
Okay. Gensen, great question.
Can you
So,
just tell us what that question
oh,
is?
sure. Well, how has historic research at the Smithsonian changed since primary sources are now so frequently online and digital? What benefits and challenges does that alteration present? Wonderful question. Of course, we've been digitizing collections really actively for a couple decades, but now, of course, we're embarked here on a very kind of rapid, if not radical, digitization project. What we're seeing is that it, of course, democratizes access. The higher res, the better the metadata, all of what we've learned about digital archiving means a couple of things. One, you can kind of, especially 3D digitization, you can actually really try to get a sense. You can zoom in with incredible granularity on handwriting and on object details. It necessitates, though, an equal commitment to that digital archive or to that digital repository. You're basically creating a whole other library or a whole other archive that has its own preservation, longevity, access standards, just like their physical counterparts. So the gone are the days where it's like, oh, we'll take a picture and put it online because remember you go to old websites and they have those like black boxes where there used to be an image. You can imagine that at scale, and that's what happens, right? To if you don't necessarily, use all of the contemporary understanding of digital archiving. What we're finding on the research side and on the access side is that it dramatically democratizes access, which I truly love. In fact, of the 12 million people who visit us online, a really good proportion of those are there for the collection. And they stay longer and they work in the collection. We have community crowdsourced parts of the archive, digital archive, that ask people who are proficient in Mandarin or other dialects to help us translate our vast collection of Chinese banknotes. And people love it. They'll spend all of these hours helping us, basically understand our own collection, but now that we've made it available online. The second key thing is that people's thirst for the authentic seemingly grows. And this is now documented over the last 15, 20 years, in which you see something online and then you really want to see it in person, or you want to go into that file where that document is and see what's adjacent to it. But we're seeing a lot of people who now come in saying, oh, I saw this online and I really wanted to see it in person. That's post-COVID, but it also existed pre-COVID. So I think that kind of connection with the authentic through the digital pathway is I think really dynamic and incredibly exciting, and keep on want to work in that space. So in language equity, language justice is actually a lot of people in California pioneered it first, but it sets a standard for how you want to communicate, in which language, via which means, and it puts I think a really important challenge and onerous on institutions like ours to really help people learn where they're most comfortable. So I asked for a language justice tiger team, just like people raised their hands in the summer of 2019, who presented me with the most recent, then 5 years ago, studies around what language justice looked like. So I'm happy to pop that in the chat. So like, I wish we were like some of the California institutions. By the way, Daniela, thank you so much for the question. Staying on language justice, when I left San Francisco, like the Exploratorium took the top 5 languages spoken in San Francisco and offered programs in all of them. I don't know, and I think maybe sometimes even did all their labels. We're sticking with the top 2 languages, but like for the Chinese, the Chinatown banner from San Francisco, that's in 3 languages. We are doing more with spoken language, where you see a little QR code and you put your phone there because you found out that there's a QR code by 2 cane taps, which are 2 stainless steel taps on the floor. And if your cane taps them, you know that there is a QR code there that your phone will pick up, and then you can listen to the verbal description of what you're seeing. We do a lot with that. We do a lot with Gallaudet. We do a lot for the deaf community because we have Gallaudet University just up the street. But it means a lot of things, and we're still definitely getting there. Eugene Lee, regarding events happening outside. Oh, it's a fantastic question. So it's basically, what is the scope of American history or U.S. history? I wish we could call it U.S. history, because the Americas, of course, are the entirety of the Americas, not just our part of North America. We do quite a bit global, with kind of the global intersectionality of U.S. policy and U.S. mostly around wars and politics. I wish we did a bit more culturally, although we do some, certainly. I don't think we do as good job as we should, personally, because I think it would be so helpful for people understand the context of what's happening in Gaza right now, in Israel, to understand a kind of a broader context. The focus is
Can I just follow up?
Yeah.
I mean, because one of the important developments in
Uh-huh.
the practice of U.S. history has
Uh-huh.
been expansion beyond U.S. borders. U.S. in the world is now
Sure.
kind of a way of framing U.S. history.
Yeah,
Um, is that part of the purview of the museum as you
absolutely.
understand it? It
Yeah,
is.
I think it has to be. It hasn't been. I mean, candor is our code. It's really been. I mean, you can talk about like, French involvement in the Revolutionary War, which is fine, great. I mean, it was definitely a global war of empires,
Right.
but to me, that's a soft lob in a game of hardball. Um, so I think we should do much better because we don't necessarily also tell the story of diplomacy. Um, our our historians of American business, I think, are far more savvy in understanding the kind of the global nation, let's say, of labor or of transport. Um, but it's sometimes, I mean, it's hard to get out of the America first, you know, mentality, and we didn't talk much about that, but I wrestle with that all the time. It's just that, um, and why we changed our mission when I first came. Um, to be very future facing, but also to really think, kind of what does it mean to show that full and rich complexity of the past. Yeah, I think it's a big challenge, especially going into 2026, which will be the
Mm.
250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, the 25th year since 9/11, the 5th year since January 6th. It'll be 2026. Joe, oh, I love Hartman's work.
Mm.
Yeah. Thank you so much for bringing that up. Um, the First, just saying critical fabulation is just fabulous anyway. But I think that there's a couple of key texts in the past, let's say 5 years, 6 years, that like Dear Science, I think is also brilliant, but that really takes I think a real powerful and a very nuanced understanding of the work that we do. And I'd love to talk to you more about that, but I think am I supposed to be done now?
We have time, actually.
Excuse me, I just need some water. Yeah.
Yeah. We have
Maybe
a bit more time.
Joe, if you don't mind, let's see, where are you? If you don't mind coming on camera or just unmuting yourself while I'm having some water, share with me kind of what brought Hartman's work to the fore for you.
Yeah, it's actually been just really relevant in my own research, which I'm not going to go into.
Hmm.
But when Professor Myers was opening up and just talking about, what is history and think of it as a narrative,
Yeah.
it brought to mind Professor Hartman's
Hmm.
article, Intimate History, Radical Narrative, where she's
Yeah.
bringing in critical fabulation.
Yeah.
And I actually had the pleasure of taking a course with Professor Kelly
Oh,
this
nice.
past quarter, and
Yeah.
he had said, in a sense, like all history is critical fabulation,
Right.
because all like none of it is objective, and so we're
Yeah.
critically fabulating and filling in,
Yeah.
these gaps in the archive, and sort of compensating for the lack of certain materials or certain contexts that we have.
Hmm.
And there's these, various interpretations or readings of events, movements, people.
Hmm.
Um, so I really wrestle with that question and how critical fabulation can not only just like play a role when we think about racial dynamics, but particularly
Sure.
like the queering of certain like historical figures, and having a very like LGBTQ centric read of certain historical
Mhm.
movements.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I do that um, with James Smithson, you know, code for never married in 18, in the early 1800s often meant a queer life. Not always. Um, but what about the United States, captured him? What he wrote about the United States is that he could live in a, if he were there, he would not be not bound to basically the conventions and the understanding of caste, gentility into which he was born. So where's that space? We benefit so much from people who could tell their story with openness, but as you know, that's especially in terms of querying history, that's a very, very recent and still highly complicated and contested path for some to take in that way. So when we go back in time, like in our Entertainment Nation Nación de lo Spectáculo exhibition, we know because she has been so honest with us and the world about her path, that Billie Jean King, we have her dress that she wore when she beat Bobby Riggs in the Battle of the Sexes in 1973. But Billie Jean's been such an incredible guide for us understanding kind of what that meant in sports, what it meant for her. And as you know, I mean, that's 50 years. It's not 500 years, and that's certainly complicated. But and just real quickly about critical fabulations is that I defend that on a very basic level, Joe, and let me see if I can put it succinctly. Who is to say that the type of critical fabulations that we can see to fill in spaces and lives and meaning in those whose lives have been marginalized, destroyed, compromised, not told that they will never be a part of the narrative, who are they basically to judge when what we've inherited as hegemonic history is probably sometimes acritical fabulations, right? It's different sets of stories that have been told to us to create a kind of comprehensive white dominant narrative. And so I think if we would just be open to that, and I think the art world does a better job sometimes than the policy world or the history world about being open to that that both, I think, beautiful and vulnerable spot where we give away that and kind of release that authority of knowledge and of storytelling in the kind of the dominant way. But it's a great question, and it's a great way to kind of end, because now I think we do have to. But it's really special for me to be with all of you, and I love your questions, and I'm serious about staying in touch. This is Anthea Marie Hartig's private understanding of James Smithson. Oh, and Tammy echoes Joe, you're bringing up Professor Hartman. So
Wait, Anthea, before you leave us,
yeah.
I wonder if you could just sort of bring together some of the threads in
Mhm.
our conversation
Mhm.
and really home in on a key term that I heard in your discussion, which was the word justice, and how you understand the connection between history and justice.
Yeah, thank you. I'll pop something in the chat, and then I'd love for you guys to. You're gonna capture the chat, yeah, right, Rose?
Yeah.
So let me pop this in quickly. This is probably my colleagues say it better than I, but I'll share it with you. So take a look at this when you can, and think with me on it. Justice for me, it's through this lens, right, is we take all that we know as historians, we take the practices of our craft, and how we then practice history in the world, And that combined with restorative justice, which identifies harm, sits with harm, understands harm, asks communities what they need, not what we need, not what we think they should do, or we think that would help, but really, sits with communities to understand how history can help that harm be repaired, or start on a road to reparation, help with the road to reparation. It starts with so many. It starts with the earliest poets and thinkers and artists and people we know and people will never know, who pushed the ideals of freedom, to a very inclusive point, which we are of course nowhere near. So that kind of long path of understanding what that journey looks like. Of course, the opening page of our center's website, of course, quotes James Baldwin in that amazing 1963 address he gave to teachers, about that American history is longer, larger, more varied, more beautiful, more terrible. So that certainly sustains me. But really grounding our work in the long march of equity and its fullest expression of our human dignity and our shared humanity, is what gets me up every morning, and it makes me really so proud to do this work, as those tellers of stories and seekers of truth.
Well, I have to say, I mean, you uniquely, Anthea, can sort of train your lens on sort of the inner workings of history and policy in Washington, D.C., and then zoom out to sort of the biggest questions about what are we doing as historians. And the center's work is so germane and relevant, and we wish it and the museum the very best of success. Thanks so much for making time to be with us. Really been wonderful to have you.
Thank you. Please be in touch. Shrouding you in all kinds of good wishes and goodwill and hope. And I look forward to the next time we can be together. And I can stay on for a bit. I know you have more to do. I've got a couple minutes. So.
Okay. Well, on that note, I have some disappointing news, which is we heard just a bit ago that our next speaker, Tatiana Londoño, has come down with is not well, and won't be able to be with us at the assigned slot. Perhaps we can find some time to share with you a video that she is willing to make based on what she had hoped to present. Tatiana, as we've come to know, is a leading expert on social welfare and immigration policy, and really someone who represents the near perfect juncture of history and policy. She teaches in the Luskin School of Public Affairs, and we wish her the best in recovering from her illness. So what we're going to do instead is